Chapter 3 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jerry Dixon, Zephyr Hills, Florida. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 3 The Battle of Svold Island, A.D. 1000. In the story of the battles of Salamis and Actium, we have seen what naval warfare was like in Greek and Roman times. It would be easy to add other examples, but they would be only repetitions of much the same story, for during the centuries of the Roman power there was no marked change in naval architecture or the tactics of warfare on the sea. We pass then over 1,000 years to a record of naval war waged in the beginning of the Middle Ages by northern races. People who had independently of Greek or Roman evolved somewhat similar types of ships, but who were better sailors, though for all that they still used the ship not so much as an engine of war as the floating platform on which warriors might meet in hand-to-hand conflict. Norseman, Dane, and Swede were all of kindred blood. The landlocked Baltic, the deep fjords of the Scandinavian peninsula, the straits and inlets of the archipelago that fringes its North Sea coast, were the waters on which they learned such skill in seamanship that they soon launched out upon the open sea, and made daring voyages, not only to the Orkneys and the Hebrides, and the Atlantic seaboard of Ireland, but the Faroes, and to still more distant Iceland and Greenland, and then southward to Vineland, the mainland of America, long after rediscovered by the navigators of the 15th century. There is a considerable intermixture of Norse blood in the peoples of Great Britain and Ireland, and perhaps from this sea-loving race comes some of the spirit of adventure that has helped so much to build up our own naval power. When Nelson destroyed and captured the Danish fleet at Copenhagen, the Danes consoled themselves by saying that only a leader of their own blood could have conquered them, and that Nelson's name showed he came of the Viking line. A chronicler tells how Charlemagne in his old age once came to a village on the North Sea shore and camped beside it. Looking to seaward he saw far out some long low ships, with gaily painted oars, dragon-shaped bows, and sails made of brightly colored lengths of stuff sewn together and adorned with embroidery along the yard. Tears came to his eyes as he said, "These sea dragons will tear asunder the empire I have made." They were Viking cruisers, on their way to plunder some coast town, and the old emperor's prophecy was verified when the Norman, who was a civilized Norseman, became for a while the conquering race of Europe. Even before the death of Charlemagne, the Norse and Danish sea kings were raiding, plundering, and burning along the coasts of his empire. 200 years of our own history is made up of the story of their incursions. England and Ireland bore the first brunt of their onset, when they found the ways of the sea. But they ravaged all the western coasts of Europe, and even showed themselves in the Mediterranean. From the end of the 8th till the beginning of the 11th century, they were the terror of the western world, and early in that dark and stormy period, their raids had grown into great expeditions. They landed armies that marched far inland, and they carved out principalities for themselves. Western Europe had a brief respite at times when the Vikings fought amongst themselves. In early days there were frequent struggles for supremacy in Norway between local kinglets and ambitious chiefs. Fighting was in the blood of the Northmen. Two sea-roving squadrons would sometimes challenge each other to battle for the mere sake of a fight. As Norway coalesced into a single kingdom, and as the first teachers of Christianity induced the kings to suppress piracy, there was more of peace and order on the northern seas. But in this transition period there was more than one struggle between the Scandinavian kingdoms, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. One of the most famous battles of these northern wars of the sea kings was fought in this period, when the old wild days of sea roving were drawing to an end, and its picturesque story may well be told as that of a typical Norse battle, for its hero, King Olaf Tryggvason, was the ideal of a northern sea king. Olaf was a descendant of the race of Harald Harfager, fair-haired Harold, the warrior who had united the kingdom of Norway, and made himself its chief king at the close of the 9th century. But Olaf came of a branch of the royal house that civil war had reduced to desperate straits. He was born when his mother Astrid was a fugitive in a lonely island of the Baltic. As a boy he was sold into slavery in Russia. There, one day in the marketplace of an Esthonian town, he was recognized by a relative, Sigurd, the brother of Astrid, and was freed from bondage and trained to arms as a page at the court of the Norse adventurers who ruled the land. The saga tells how Olaf, the son of Tryggve, grew to be tall of stature and strong of limb, and skilled in every art of land and sea, of peace and war. None swifter than he on the snowshoes in winter, no bolder swimmer when the summer had cleared the ice from the waters. He could throw darts with both hands, he could toss up two swords, catching them like a juggler, and keeping one always in the air. He could climb rocks and peaks like a mountain goat. He could row and sail, and had been known to display his daring skill as an athlete by running along the moving oars outside the ship. He could ride a horse and fight, mounted or on foot, with axe or sword, with spear or bow. In early manhood he came back to Norway to avenge the death of his father, Tryggve, and then took to sea roving, for piracy was still the Norseman's trade. He raided the shores of the continent from Friesland to northern France, but most of his piratical voyages were to the shores of our own islands, and many a seaboard town in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland saw Olaf's plundering squadron of swift ships. 5 was the number of them with which he visited the Orkneys. The Viking warships were small vessels. The ship dug out of the great grave mound at Sandefjord in Norway, and now shown at Christiania, is 77 feet long, with a beam of 17 amidships, and a depth of just under 6 feet. Her draught of water would be only 4 feet, and she would lie very low in the water, but her lines are those of a good sea-boat. She had one mast, 40 feet high, to carry a cross yard and a square sail, and she had 32 oars, 16 on each side. It says something for the seamanship of the Northmen that it was with ships like this they sailed the Atlantic waves off the west coast of Ireland and made their way by the North Sea and the verge of the Arctic to the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and the mysterious Vineland. Raiding in the Irish Sea, Olaf Tryggvason made a stay in a harbour of the Scilly Islands, and there he became a convert to Christianity. On the same voyage he married the Countess Gyde, sister of his namesake Olaf Kvaran, the Danish king of Dublin. It was while he was staying in Ireland with the Dublin Danes that he heard news from Norway that opened larger ambitions to him. The land was divided among many chiefs, and the most powerful of them was hated as an oppressor by the people, who, he was told, would gladly welcome as their king a leader as famed as Olaf Tryggvason, and representing the line of Harold the Fair-haired. Helped by the Danes of Ireland, he sailed back to Norway to win its crown for himself, and to cast down the worship of Thor and Odin, and make the land part of Christendom. In the first enterprise he was quickly successful, and in 995 he was recognized as King of Norway at Trondheim. During the 5 years that he reigned, he devoted much of his energy to the second part of his mission, and made among his countrymen many real converts, and found still more ready to accept external conformity. Sometimes he would argue, exhort, appeal to the reason and the goodwill of chiefs and people. But often the old Viking spirit of his pagan days would master him, and he would hack down with his battle-axe the emblems and the altars of Thor and Odin, and challenge the old gods to avenge the insult if they had the power, and then tell the startled onlookers that if they were to be loyal to him and live in peace, they must accept the new and better creed. The open sea and the deep fjords running far into the hills were the best highways of his kingdom, and Olaf spared no effort to maintain a good fighting fleet, the best ships of which lay anchored before his great hall at Trondheim when he was at home. When he went out to war his path was by the sea. He hunted down the pirates and destroyed their strongholds in the northern fjords, with none less the zeal because these places were also the last refuge of the old paganism and its berserker magicians. He had built for his own use a ship called the Crane, Trainen, longer than ships were usually made at the time, and also of narrower beam. Her additional length enabled more oars to be used, and her sharp bow, carved into a bird's head, and her graceful lines made her the fastest